Today's show is brought to you in part by Liquid Web. Look, there's a lot of choices out there when it comes to hosting your WordPress site, but Liquid Web is the managed WordPress partner you've been waiting for. Whether you're a business owner, an agency, or a freelancer, Liquid Web has you covered when it comes to performance, uptime, and ease of site management. And one of the things I love most, if your traffic spikes due to you going viral on the internet or any other reason, they're not going to use that traffic to charge you more. The price is the price you pay, period. If your website makes you money, use Liquid Web. They've got your back. Now they're offering a special deal to listeners of this show. You can save 40% for 4 months of hosting when you use the code OfficeHoursFM over at liquidweb.com/managedwordpress/officehours. Welcome to Office Hours FM. I'm your host, Carrie Dills. Today's episode is number 9 in a series that's meant to give you a complete experience of taking a project from cradle to successful launch. By bringing together successful freelancers, thought leaders in digital, and people who've ranged from freelance to enterprise, I've curated the best advice from the most relevant point of views to help you succeed. I've got Diane Kinney back on the show. Now, she's the founder of the Versatility Group, which is a boutique professional services firm. Over the last 20 years, she's used her extensive business and technology experience to help clients achieve meaningful results with digital projects. She's worked with publicly traded companies and enterprise clients to craft smart solutions and deliver multi-million-dollar projects on time and in budget. She specializes in marketing, growth strategy, both of which she's helped me with, workflow optimization, and creating operational efficiencies. Actually, I think she's helped me with all of those things. Last week, I had her on the show, and we talked about project management strategies. This week, we're going to get down into the details of actual project management tactics. So creating project plans and some things to keep in mind as you decide what tool to use on any given project. After a quick word from our sponsor, we'll get into the show. This part of the show is brought to you by SiteLock. Attention all website owners. Do you know the average website experiences 22 attacks per day? That's more than 8,000 attacks per year per website. Are you confident that you're protected from these constantly evolving threats? One way to find out is to get a free risk assessment from SiteLock, the leader in website security. The SiteLock risk assessment analyzes hundreds of variables and calculates a website's risk of being compromised. Using this information, the SiteLock team of security experts work with you to help ensure that you're well informed and can make proactive decisions about the security of your website. Visit sitelock.com/office-hours-risk to get your free assessment today. You can also just call 888-878-2417 to get that free assessment. And now, on to the show. Hey, Diane, it is great to have you back on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Carrie. How are you?
Just fine. Thank you. So recently, you and I talked about project management from the perspective of kind of an overview from a strategy standpoint and not necessarily deep diving into specific tactics or tools. And I love the information you shared in the previous episode. And so this episode, I was hoping we could extend that conversation and get down into the dirty details. Are you ready?
I am.
Sweet. So when it comes to project management, there are various approaches, I guess you could say, that you could take. So waterfall, agile, etc. Could you kind of overview what those different methodologies are and outline their differences?
Sure. The classic methodology for project management is waterfall, which is characterized by having fixed elements, clear dependencies, lots of check-ins for reviews and approvals. So if you think of it as, kind of lines moving across the page, you can't proceed with, section 2 until section 1 is complete. You can't proceed with section 3 until section 2 is fully done and checked off. So that's really the classic approach and where most software development started. Then quite a few years ago, there was a methodology that started getting publicized called Agile. And Agile was completely different than waterfall. It was characterized by what are called sprints which are defined time periods of work. There's usually someone who acts as the product owner, and there's a process of Scrum and a Scrum Master. So if you've watched the show Silicon Valley, they are working in an agile methodology. So they have a board that's full of Post-it notes, and the developer goes up to the board, grabs a Post-it note, takes ownership of it, and moves it, through the columns. It's in progress, it's testing, it's finished. Multiple things happen simultaneously. Then there's kind of a hybrid methodology, which is in reality probably what most people use. So they have flexibility in that they're incorporating elements of waterfall, they're incorporating elements of agile, or maybe they're even creating, their own mini methodologies that specifically work for them. Like I've done things in the past where we called it time boxing and said, okay, we need to research and figure out a solution. We're going to give this 3 days and do all our research and test and dig in and see what it looks like. And at the end of 3 days, we're going to make a decision. So the real key with methodology, I think, is not to get hung up on it. All methodologies are valid, and you can mix them together. So you can have elements of a waterfall methodology, which is probably going to happen for most of us because we need review and approval from clients, at certain junctures. But we might also do things where, let's say you're engaged to work with some in-house resources on developing a plugin, that might feel more agile than waterfall. So it's good to know the background, but I don't think you have to spend a lot of time unless your, official job is project management to really dig in.
Okay. I got to say that Scrum Master sounds like something from a Dungeons and Dragons game, or I don't know.
Probably not an accident. Nerdy as it gets.
So I guess a couple of questions to go back and wrap a little bit of context. And the first is, at what point in a project timeline are we thinking about what type of approach or methodology is going to be most appropriate to the team or most appropriate to the project? Is this like after we've got a project scoped and we've kind of, money is exchanged hands or a signed contract or something of that nature is exchanged hands, or is it further back up the chain?
It's probably depending on the size of the project and the complexity of the project. So if you're working on a website redesign that has some, elements that you're familiar with and you're not doing a lot of new things, you can probably apply, develop your project plan and methodology when contracts are signed and money changes hands, because it's something you've done before and, you can repeat that project plan. If you're doing something that's new and different, you should definitely be thinking about the project management process while scope and discovery are happening. So if you're doing something that's more complex, different, building something custom, managing a lot of disparate elements, like maybe you're doing, 6 or 8 things for this client that need to coincide at certain points. Maybe there's an app that goes with a website or, things that have relationships. You need to be very heads up about that early in the process. The one thing that characterizes a project is the fact that it has a start date, an end date, and a budget. So your goal when you're creating a project plan is always to be focusing on, that period of time and that amount of resources. You're not looking at, a 3-year extended, multi-phase relationship. You're focusing on something that starts, ends, and has a certain number of resources.
Imagine that. Something clearly defined.
Clearly defined.
And, of these methodologies, do you find that So let's say that we're talking about a one-man freelancer shop, or possibly, a small agency with 2 to 3 players. Does one methodology, and I know you said not to get hung up, but I'm just trying to get the picture. Does a particular methodology work better based on team size than other? Like, does it make sense to go agile if you're just a one-man shop?
I think honestly that most of today's projects kind of fall into the hybrid model because even in a smaller team, there are things that you can multi-thread. So conventionally, we're going to have a research and discovery phase, but it's entirely possible for the person or the team to be setting up the development environment, because that's not a dependency. You're going to need a development environment or some elements of one, no matter what you're going to do. So there are often things that can be stacked because they're not dependent on each other. And then there are some things that are clearly, have to start and end before other things do. Like if your process, your agreement with your client, calls for a complete design and sign off on that before any build out starts, then you have to work that way. Now, there are a lot of projects where that's not the case. As the world moves to, designing components or styled elements and not necessarily one fixed rigid design. So all of those things are going to factor into how you build your project plan.
Okay, so let's dig into this project plan that you've mentioned a few times. What exactly is that? Like, what does that entail?
The elements of a project plan are tasks and subtasks, which are actual granular items of work to be performed. So when you're creating tasks and subtasks, you're wanting to get down to a fairly specific level. When you put a group of tasks and subtasks together, then you have something that's called a phase. So a design phase or a research phase or a feature build phase. So you want to get very specific with your tasks and subtasks and group them into phases. The other thing that you want to do with a project plan that's so key is understanding where your dependencies exist. So we naturally, work with a lot of dependencies. We sometimes don't call them that, but a classic example is getting design sign off before you start the build process, or Q&Aing a plugin before you finalize the build. Delivery of content might be a dependency. So anything that's a prerequisite or required element before you do something else, you've got to identify those dependencies. Another element of a project plan is a milestone. When you're working with clients, or even when you're, working for yourself, you want pause points in the project where you kind of review and assess where are we relative to the timeline and the deadlines? How much budget and resources have we used? What kind of communication do we need to do? So those typically come in the form of milestones. So when you initially build that project, you're going to set those points and say, this is where we're going to, reflect, assess, communicate before, we mark this milestone as completed. And then the last element of a project plan is resources. You are probably a resource for your projects, but you want to also think in terms of who else are resources on the project. Your client is a resource. You need them for input, review, and approval. You might need them for content. Perhaps there's someone that you're outsourcing some specific technical tasks to. Maybe you're working with a writer, photographer. All of those would be considered resources that you need to identify.
I got kind of a random association going on in my head, which is thinking about it as a road trip. Like, if I say that my project is to drive from Texas to Florida, and my timeline is I've got 5 days to do it and my budget is I've got $500 to spend, then I'm mapping out my points along the way, and maybe I'm not staying in a hotel because $500 I can chew up in gas. And my milestones are, when those points along the way. I don't know. That might be ridiculous. It was just the visual I got.
It's actually not. It's a great analogy because it also creates an easy way to think about contingencies. So you have a plan. You're driving from Texas to Florida. These are your milestones. This is your budget. You have it all neatly planned out. And then, a hurricane blows up through the Gulf. Problem. So a lot of project management is we're focusing on, the initial creation of a project plan, but it's important to remember that what you're building for yourself is a tool to manage the project. So this isn't a static entity. This is a tool that you're going to use to manage something that's never actually going to occur the way you've mapped it out. Things will finish faster, things will take longer. It's very dynamic and always moving. So your goal is to create a tool that's going to let you see that and adjust on an as-needed basis.
Excellent. And we're going to get into those. I'm going to ask you about some of those tools in just a moment. I did want to kind of dig in, though, on maybe some examples of what so you said there's tasks, there's subtasks, and then there's phases that's, sort of umbrella over those. If we took, let's say that I'm doing a brand, I don't know, a brand redesign or something. So I'm doing this project scope, and one of those things is create a logo, which I know is not at all a brand strategy. I'm just throwing easy examples out there. So what in that case, as part of my project scope, I'm saying, okay, well, I've got, in order to build a logo, first I've got to determine a typeface or a color palette or a mood board or blah, blah, blah. Are those examples of things that would be tasks and subtasks?
Yes. And subtasks are kind of optional depending on how big, your project is and how you want to manage things. So let's say that the process of creating a logo has 3 phases, roughly. You're going to do your research and preparation, you're going to do design work, and then you're going to do revisions. So within doing your research and preparation, you might have tasks like gathering examples for inspiration, creating a mood board. You might have tasks like creating a color palette, based on what the client already has in place. Maybe they want a new brand identity, but they're happy with their brand colors. So you may have a series of tasks within that phase. And sometimes some people like subtasks and some people don't. So I tend to like everything broken down as much as I can get it. So I have a tendency to use subtasks. So I might have a task that's, competitive research. And within that, I might have subtasks to, figure out who their brand competitors are, figure out, creating a folder of what people are doing in that space type of thing. And it doesn't truly matter whether you have 14 tasks or, 10 tasks and 5 subtasks, as long as it works for you and what you're doing. Another consideration with tasks and subtasks is people resources. So if you have multiple people working on a team, breaking things out into subtasks is an opportunity to easily delegate something to someone else. So if I create a subtask, it could be something that I assign to a junior designer or, a VA to go do. And it makes that easy in terms of, utilizing software.
Okay, well, let's talk about software. I know project management is a skill, not a tool. Which I actually love that quote from you. But indeed, there are software tools out there. So can we move in and talk about some of those?
Yes, there are many, many software tools. And what I think is kind of interesting is most of the tools that we call project management tools, and I'm thinking of Basecamp, Asana, Trello, Freecamp, Teamwork. There are so many. Actually, most of them offer features that go beyond project management. So they give you communication boards, places to upload files. They're very, very rich. When we look at the process for project management, the classic approach is using a Gantt chart. And that's a feature that most of these tools offer as an extension or an add-on. A Gantt chart is a visual tool that shows you bar lines that go from left to right, and has the ability to connect them so that you can actually create dependencies. It has a function where you can designate milestones, and it has the ability to associate resources with tasks. Using a Gantt chart is probably one of the easiest ways to build a project plan because it's very interactive. So when you begin and you start loading in tasks, you can just load all your tasks, for example, that you've identified. Then you can start grouping them into phases. Then you can start applying timelines, and you can take a phase and make it dependent on another phase. And so what happens is you go through this build process, which is quicker and easier than I'm making it sound. As you start to push and pull, and change dates, everything's going to change for you.
What I love, the first time I laid eyes on a Gantt chart, I think the nerd in me squealed with delight. And it's because it's so visual, it's easy to show, okay, look, here we've got this dependency, and this entire phase can't move forward until this dependency is complete. So if we just scoot that dependency, the completion of that back by like 2 weeks, we see the entire chart shift. And
exactly.
And all of a sudden our project is now extended beyond, there was a hurricane blowing through the Gulf Coast.
Exactly. Or when you think about something like as you're laying out milestones, like maybe there's a milestone of design approval by the client. And maybe the client is in Dubai for 3 weeks on vacation. So while in your mind, you thought that might be, no more than 5 days between phase 1 and phase 2, the client isn't even available at that time. That it's simply not going to happen because they're gone for 3 weeks. Then they're going to come back and it's not going to be their first priority. So juggling those dependencies starts to become really, really helpful because it's quick and easy, it's visual, and all of a sudden you can see, oh, well, I thought this was a 6-week project, and it probably is in the purest sense of pure effort. In the real world, this project is going to, take about 4 months.
So you bring up an interesting point, which is clearly there needs to be communication with the client, and there would be, ideally, anyways. But as you're laying out sort of this timeline beyond what you've already agreed to in the contract, when it gets into sort of the dirty details of laying out the Gantt chart and saying, okay, on these, by such and such a date, I'm going to be looking for this for you, from this for you, et cetera. So you're giving the client then, the chance to say, hey, I'm in Dubai, so I'm not even going to be available then, so you can adjust as needed. So that's a process that's happening, I guess, from the get-go.
Yeah, this is kind of a critical project management practice. So you built your project plan, which is somewhat hypothetical. You took the information you had available, you sat down and built the project plan. You've created your Gantt chart that shows how things are all fitting together. Now you need to go around and you need to skillfully, fact check that with the members of your team. So you need to go over it with the client, and then you say to the client, so we have you scheduled to do design review on such and such a date. And the client's like, oh no, I'm going to be in Dubai. Maybe you're working with the developer who's doing your build for you, or you're working with a firm that's doing a custom piece of functionality. And you say, okay, we have you scheduled to start June 27th and finish by this date. And they say, oh, well, since last time we talked, this has changed. So we need to start a week earlier, or we're not available until 2 weeks later. And this circle of input and then adjusting, your project plan with a couple of clicks of a Gantt chart becomes very powerful. And the same thing continues to apply when you start managing the project. You keep updating and modifying things, so you always have a realistic view of what's happening.
Wow, that's great stuff to think about. And I know, as a freelancer or somebody who's working alone, you're wearing all the hats. And I've kind of come to hate that phrase, but I don't know what else there is for it, other than you're multitasking a whole lot of roles. And as the technician, which most freelancers, that's the part they're good at, right? They're good at doing whatever,
yes,
developing or designing or writing or whatever that painting, whatever the skill is. But this project management piece is a whole other kind of entity to sit on top of that technician layer. And so when things happen, like delays or the fact that there is that huge need for communication up front, that's where I think if a lot of projects can just end up in frustration for that technician if the project management piece hasn't been handled well.
Right. I would say that that's the number one cause of conflict, frustration, less than ideal feelings between folks and their clients is if the last work you do on expectations, is kind of that scope discovery contract process, and you think to yourself, okay, I laid out what I'm going to do, and then you kind of just go off and do it, you're leaving the client in the dark. And it makes a lot more sense to build a project plan where you actually incorporate content delivery, communication, all these things that projects get hung up on. Projects get hung up on them because we're not giving them enough focus and attention. It's not enough to say to a client, oh, and I'm putting you down basically to have all the content done by such and such a date. That's just not enough. Or, we're going off now for 6 weeks and we'll come back to you, when we hit the first milestone. Clients aren't project managers, they're not technicians. So this concept of, communication and feedback and updates in a structured manner makes all the difference.
Good stuff. Oh my gosh, we've almost been talking 30 minutes and I'm not through asking you questions, so we'll just charge ahead. So another thing I wanted to ask you about, I've heard discussions or kind of different philosophies of, well, I use Basecamp. For every project, I use Basecamp. And it doesn't matter what my client is used to using, or maybe they're not used to using anything at all. They're going to use Basecamp if they're going to work for me, or, insert whatever piece of software. I know you've got a comment. I'm going to finish my question. You're ready. You're coming out the gate. So I guess it's a two-parter question. One is, how do you consider working with your kind of suite of comfortable project management tools versus stepping into a client's environment where maybe they've already got kind of that structure set up. So that's the first part. And two is, I guess it's a piggyback question, but kind of putting a square peg in a round hole in terms of every project is going to fit in this particular structure or use this particular tool.
I think, in my opinion, that the mentality of this is my tool and, by gosh, you're going to use it is incredibly flawed. Because I think fundamentally, you have to make a decision whether you're a service provider, or a technician, really. Is your goal to deliver code and design, or is it to deliver a good product with a good experience for the client? And so, clients can fall in a lot of pockets. There are clients who've never used any of the tools that we use for any reason. And it's not going to make sense to them. They don't know where to do things. Then there's another scenario where you're working with larger clients who may have familiarity with different tool sets. I think it's an important conversation to have. And it's an important conversation to have before you write the proposal or do the scope for the project. If you make an assumption that you're going to introduce a new tool to a client and it's just going to work perfectly for them and your process isn't going to change in any way, and then that turns out not to be the case, you're going to spend time, energy, and frustrate your client. So it's really better to figure that out during discovery and scope, the concept of how are we going to work together? How are we going to communicate? How do I want to receive input from you? How do you want to receive updates from me? When tasks need to be assigned, how do we want to do that? Have that conversation, as part of your process, just so you get a sense of what's going to be possible, and what's going to work well. I don't think there's one size fits all. And I think you can say, this is my process, fit in it, or I won't work with you. But that seems like a very limiting strategy.
Oh, Diane, I always enjoy what you have to say, frankly, regardless of the topic. But these are these little golden nuggets. So I guess, let's say that you're working with a small client, and I'm going to use the word unsophisticated, and that does not mean that they are stupid. It just means that they don't understand my world and my technology. I'm coming to them as the expert providing a service. So in that case, would the approach be, hey, we're going to need to be communicating about things. We're going to need to have a way that I get information from you and you get information from me. I have some suggestions on that. I would like, do you have anything in place that you would like me to know about? Or how would you approach that conversation?
I would approach it just like that. During this project, we're going to need to get items from you. We're going to need you to, complete tasks. And Erin Flynn has a really good, some really good stuff on onboarding, which is where I would have these conversations. So, I'm bringing this client on board for this project, and I need to be really clear about how we're going to communicate on things. And maybe that client is comfortable, getting task assignments from a project management system, and that's fantastic. If they're not, if you're getting that sense of, okay, I've never done anything like that before, or you can end up with a client who, assigns you a task in a project management system that says things like, can we have a quick call today? That happens over and over. Something's not working there, right? So you need to I guess, plan for some flexibility. And I think we, as technicians, have a lot of skills in making things work in different ways. So if you have somebody who isn't super great at, maybe logging into a system and utilizing it, I think almost every system has the ability to capture tasks by email address, leveraging, things like that. Just try to be flexible. Try to think of yourself as a customer service provider, and don't make assumptions that a very, rigid process that you've come to love is going to work for everybody.
That's fantastic. I actually had a couple follow-up questions, but that was such a good note to end on. I'm gonna I'm gonna call it, but I'm gonna follow up this a couple of notes for you guys that are listening. I had Aaron Flynn on the show earlier this season to talk specifically about onboarding, so I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. And then Diane, not to put you on the spot here, but if I go and write maybe a blog post over on my website, carriedills.com, could I maybe ask you those couple of extra questions and get your
You
input
certainly can.
Excellent. Okay, dear. Well, I will let you plan for the next hurricane that's going to be coming through Florida, or whatever whatever storm awaits. But Diane, I always appreciate your expertise and just coming on the show to share. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And that wraps up another episode of Office Hours FM. I appreciate you joining me and tuning in. If you want me to let you know when new episodes are coming out, just sign up for emails at officehours.fm/subscribe. You can also find the show notes and links for this episode and the full archive of episodes over at officehours.fm. As always, if you enjoy what you hear on the show, just share it with someone else who you think might enjoy it too. Until the next time, cheers!